Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Jackie Martin toku ingoa. Welcome to our November IABC event and welcome to the conversation about our tech giants and our relationship with them. Is this a healthy relationship? Is this an abusive relationship? What should we be thinking about and what should we be looking out for? I am really pleased to welcome Duncan Grieve, the managing editor of The Spinoff, here to actually help us through this. Duncan and The Spinoff have actually been covering this for quite a while now, and they've been talking about this. So it's really great that we can actually welcome him from lockdown, Tamaki Makaurau, for one night only. Any day now, you're going to be let out. You're just counting down the hours. So thank you, Duncan. Thank you very much for joining us and actually just helping us try and get to grips with this massive topic.
Kia ora, Jackie. No, thank you so much for having me. It's my favourite subject. So apologies in advance.
That's all right. And to everybody, this is a huge topic and it is changing by the day. So we are not going to get through everything tonight. You know, this is just going to be quite something. But I thought we'd just start off. These companies, we're going to talk tonight mainly about Facebook and Google, because between the two of them, they actually have a lot of, not even the social platforms, but they actually hold a lot of our attention through the various aspects that they have. But they are big, they're ubiquitous, they're still relatively new, they're still relatively young, and I don't think we quite understand exactly what they are. I mean, like, Google's a search engine and it's great because, you know, and it's become part of the lexicon, just Google it, but it's got so many other aspects to it. And the same with Facebook. It's not just Facebook. So what are we grappling with here? Who are these organizations? What, you know, is it the newness that has got us into this predicament, or is it just a lack of awareness?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the fact that they're so difficult to wrap your head around and so complex is very much part of what makes them so difficult to discuss, and for us to conceive of how we might, as a society, respond to their growth. You know, but you know, when you boil it down to it, they are two of the sort of 5 or 6 most valuable companies in the world. Facebook's worth about $1 trillion US. Google just, I think, in the last couple of days joined the $2 trillion club. And they're so valuable because they are so wildly profitable. The pair of them make profit margins that, you know, even giant corporations in New Zealand would never even imagine. And they're in part so profitable because they pay very little tax anywhere, and they pay very little tax anywhere because of that problem you talked about at the start, that they're sort of everywhere, they're ubiquitous in our lives, and yet we don't, you know, they're very hard to pin down because they're sort of abstracted from our lives, you know, in terms of the physicality of them, like what we've as a corporation. They're very challenging to that notion. And, you know, we're just living in an internet and increasingly an economy that they control and effectively set their own rules for, without us having really considered whether that's good for us and how we might kind of shave off the bad edges of, and we saw them on the steps of Parliament today, to my mind, while still benefiting from all the great things that you discussed earlier. And I think that's why I think this is the most important topic in the world right now, because everything else is visible through it.
Yeah, and I mean, so if we start down this whole concept of, you know, what are they? Are they publishers? Are they news media? They spread information. So what do we call them in that respect? I mean, you know, yeah, what do we call them? Are they a news platform? Are they a publisher? What are they?
Well, I mean, ultimately, you kind of have to go back to what is their function for people, you know? Because fundamentally, what they are is unimagined in our regulatory framework. You know, the big enabling law for them is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act in the US, which basically absolved them from any of the consequences of anything that they distributed through which of anything that's published effectively on the internet, so long as the publisher can claim to have not had prior knowledge of what it was. And that means that's the great enabling law that no one perceived where it would go at the time. It was thought of a way of encouraging innovation, but I think no one conceived that they would grow so powerful into that regulatory void. And really smart people have argued that in fact they are publishers, because whether it's automated or by the human hand, when they use algorithms to determine what you're shown, you're effectively making editorial choices there. But I think it's very easy to get bogged down in the detail of these things. I think it's sort of best to look at their sort of impacts on society, the way that they interact with what you might term the rest of the economy, which is effectively shrinking proportionally to them every year. And then what is a rational response of a business community and a political economy to the challenges that they represent?
Yeah, because I mean, one of the issues that we grapple with, particularly as communicators, is how we get great use, we get reach that we haven't necessarily had before through these platforms because they are so ubiquitous. The ability to get messages out on Facebook to people, to get people engaged and talking to you. And yeah, okay, some of them are the people who just really want to complain, but you can actually reach out and get into these areas. But then when you've got this misinformation, when you're constantly battling against, the fact that people can just put up whatever they want, and it has the same currency as stuff that is actually more truthful or is based in fact. So it's a real struggle as communicators to engage with the platform, but also try and manage what comes back to you in the platform that you're dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, I think that tension is really central to all this. There is a message that gets put out, particularly by the platforms, but also by some there's a whole spectrum of responses to them, right? That says that you can't have the good of which you just described, and we distribute content through Facebook. We have a business relationship with Facebook in multiple ways too. So I'm not an abolitionist, like someone who's advocating for them to be abolished by any means, but I am someone who thinks that having no regulatory regime for them is very strange. If you think about the average New Zealand media company of any scale, they're likely to be subject to the Broadcasting Standards Act and Authority, the Advertising Standards Act, and Authority, the Media Council. There is a whole plethora of legislation that quite intricately erects guardrails about what they can and can't do, and it's by no means simple to do a similar thing for social media, because it impacts on free speech and all these sort of other interlocking rights that we hold. But I think the era through which you could just sort of shrug at that and say it's too difficult, it's too complex, I think it's over. And I'd like to think in a way that it might have ended today. Like I watched both 6 p.m. bulletins before I came on this call. TV3 led with the protest. It was the second item on TVNZ's news. I consider that the first 3 items on 3's news bulletin tonight were all connected to disinformation. You had the protest on the steps of Parliament. You had a report on how disinformation and misinformation has dramatically spiked. The research that Tina Nada and Kate Hanna did since the arrival of Delta. And we know that, we can sense it in the issues we've had vaccinating. And the third item was about a school in King Country that might have no teachers left at the end of the school because none of them are vaccinated at the end of this week because none of them are vaccinated. And I think you just sort of look at this and go, these companies are a basket of positive impact on society and increasingly profound negative impacts. And we're doing this from on Zoom in part because I'm in lockdown. My hair doesn't normally look like this. That's a data visualization of how long we haven't been able to get a haircut up here. And I don't mean to trivialize it, because me not getting able to get a haircut is not a major thing. But the fact is, businesses all around New Zealand are being driven to the brink because we can't move around, because the most logical, safe, what should be just a routine thing to do, getting vaccinated, is become a lightning rod political issue. And it's, so they are actively information that people will die because of it. And for us as a society, and for, for people on the school business communicators, I think it's worth thinking about how we interact with these platforms, and what it is we say publicly about them, and how we speak to government, because they are, I think, increasingly a place where we're huge danger, both reputational but also societal danger sets.
Yeah, because I mean, I remember with all of the Trump election stealing, misinformation that was floating around, and you would watch the news reports about that, and you would go, this is horrifying, but this is what happens when you're kind of in a vacuum of truth, and as a nation. Surely that would not happen here. But then I look at where we've been going, and I look at where things have been progressing around the vaccine information, and everything that's been swirling around about it. And I looked at the protesters walking down through Lambton Quay today, and just the craziness of these strange bedfellows like Trump 2020 campaigners walking alongside religious zealots, again, all sorts in that mix. And I thought, what have we moved into what I thought was unthinkable a year ago? Have we as a nation somehow been sucked into this because this information is so readily available that and there isn't that regulation, there isn't that sense of responsibility around, look, I look at Facebook and it slaps up a little banner and says, this could be COVID misinformation, but that's kind of as far as it goes. And I just feel that there's not that sense of responsibility, perhaps, in these organizations to actually go, we actually have to step up. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg took Trump off Twitter. And you go, okay, that's a great thing. But he only took Trump off Twitter. There are other people who are just as mad, spreading misinformation all over the place. Why did he only do Trump? It smacks of hypocrisy. So, yeah, I'd like to see them actually be a little bit better in this regard.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that the Facebook papers, which was the big multi-publication project to sort through that giant document that Frances Hogan, the Facebook whistleblower, took with her. If you look at the sort of abiding themes of that, they are pretty troubling. For a very lightly regulated company, which we don't even know how much business it's doing here because its accounts aren't public. But we do know that the vast majority from those papers, that the vast majority of its moderation happens in the US. I've actually asked Facebook directly, what linguistic capabilities does it have? Because we have a lot of different cultures and languages here. They essentially, they wouldn't tell me how many moderators they had on the ground in New Zealand. They wouldn't tell me how many languages they spoke. I feel like if there was a lot, if the answer to both those things was heaps of moderators and heaps of languages, they'd have told us. And it seems like something, the government, the power user of Facebook, the Prime Minister regularly live streams to her audiences there. This feels, and you see quite regularly her comments become a mix of misinformation and disinformation as well. So it just seems like something that you would want to, as a whole of society, to consider whether there isn't anything we can do here. The impact on teenagers, the fact that they're boasting about and have genuinely increased their spend on moderation, so $5 billion this year. That sounds like a huge number, but it's also exactly half what they're spending on growing the metaverse and you know, investing in creating a new internet. And I just, it does seem to me that you start to go, if you're going to have a single company almost entirely in control of the social web, you know, we have Snapchat and TikTok, which are growing very fast and have particularly TikTok its own issues as well. And obviously YouTube, which is quasi-social in some respects as well, and does tend to not get as much attention as it deserves. But the space is enormous. You know, the message that has been propagated there is, don't trust the media. That was an overwhelming message today. And it's trust social media. And I think that this is just a very dangerous combination. And, you know, I think there's been a long period where we have looked into the eye, looked the complexity in the eye and gone, not today. And sort of just sort of shrugged at it and said, oh, we'll wait on the international community to do something. We're just little New Zealand. There's nothing that can be accomplished. And I think that what we're seeing on our streets, on our phones at the moment, should give us pause, because I think it can't happen here defense is really starting to fray. And, you know, over the next few weeks, as the mandates start to roll out and as people start to feel their freedoms are inhibited by highly profitable disinformation, because this is the wild thing, right? The government has to go to these very platforms and shovel money at them to fix disinformation problems, you know, hugely expensive campaigns that are propagated by them. It's you know, if you're in the traditional media and you haven't had a dollar spent on your platforms or as any part of the COVID-19 campaign since April of 2020, you sort of think, maybe I'm in the wrong business. I need to start spreading disinformation. You know, that looks a better business.
Yeah. I mean, like the moderators one is a really interesting one. I don't know if anybody's come across it, but there was a documentary a couple of years ago at the film festival, back when we could all go to film festivals in person, called The Cleaners. And it was brutal. It was absolutely horrific to watch. It was about the content moderators who deal with the really explicit content that gets streamed over these platforms. And they're all based in Manila. And they have targets that they have to meet. And, you know, I remember hearing people, one of the guys just said, you know, I've seen multiple beheadings. You know, he says, I've watched people encourage people to commit suicide live. And you think they move this problem away. They just keep moving it away. And they really dance on the head of a pin a lot of the time about, you know, oh, well, we are doing something, but there's freedom of speech and everything. It's like, yeah, but what is the boundaries that we have to be really, really clear about? And we had this with the Christchurch call. You know, the call was made that it is not acceptable to live stream somebody massacring people in this country. And we went there and, you know, the Prime Minister said, no, this is not acceptable and we have to start. But it's kind of just dissipated. You know, what we asked of them, they kind of went, yeah, we really feel it. But it's just gone away. And you see this coming back and you go, what do we need? Do we need another Christchurch call? Do we need another horrific event? You hope that something comes out of the Facebook papers that actually says, no, this, you know, what you're doing is not right.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel like there is the beginnings of a council. And again, I want to be clear that I don't think that Facebook is beyond saving and that these companies provide no useful function. You know, I think it would be human if you didn't see news bulletins like we saw this evening and feel a sense of frustration at the pace of that. But there's absolutely a useful social role for them. And I think, you know, as speaking to a professor, you know, who's very well versed in this stuff at the University of Otago last month, and you know, he said that the Christchurch call actually has given New Zealand a kind of an imprimatur of authority in this space, more so than you might expect based purely on our relative scale. And I think because Jacinda Ardern is seen as this sort of moderate, compassionate global leader. The idea that we as a country can't participate in the debate around it is I don't think, accurate. And so what I would love to see is the debate move from this is horrible to what are some things that we might sort of plausibly try. And I think that there just isn't quite enough of that, and that happens here. But I think that if you sort of look at the way that the mainstream, or traditional media is regulated. I mean, it seems funny to refer to us as traditional media. We've been around since 2014, but nonetheless, in terms of our values and the sort of way that we try and hold ourselves, that does describe us. And the one thing that this University of Otago professor talked about was exactly what you're talking about, that moderation shouldn't be something that is outsourced. It shouldn't be something that we have no visibility or regulation over, because what they are, these are our problems. New Zealand has its own versions of this. Obviously, we saw what happened in Christchurch, but New Zealanders are putting horrific things on the internet all the time. I don't think you can morally say that's okay that the moderation of that happens in the Philippines. I don't think you can say that moderators with no Tongan, Samoan, any other Pacific languages can, that we can just not know whether they have those capabilities when they're moderating this content. And so he advocates for the professionalization of moderation, and to have something like a media council that sort of oversees it. This would be an orders of magnitude larger organization. It would be expensive to run. Facebook operates between a 35 and a 40% profit margin. It can afford this,
It's a very healthy profit margin. I'd love to see something like that.
I would too. Any margin at this point. Totally.
Yeah. And of course, we're talking a lot about Facebook, but there's also Google, who must be sitting there right now going, nothing to see here, nothing to see here. Just look at those guys. But I mean, hello, YouTube. I mean, as a parent, I spend a lot of time saying to my son, please don't believe everything. I know you're addicted to YouTube. I know you love to go on there. I know you love to, and there's lots of valuable information, but there's also horrendous rabbit holes of misinformation in a platform like that. So, yeah, and the whole concept of, when I started off in communications, we spend a lot of time learning about search engine optimization and what are the keywords we use to make sure that, our site rises to the top, and we don't get others, stealing our thunder. But Google is taking the money and steering the search in certain directions. So, what have they got to answer for as well?
I mean, Google is a different kind of problem. YouTube absolutely has large and well documented issues. I think it's slightly different to Facebook, because Facebook is not just Facebook, because it's Instagram, because it's WhatsApp, and because it's Messenger. It has so much more of the sort of total volume of communications, both public-facing and private-facing. So I think it's, it is a more complex entity to regulate. I think YouTube, to be fair, has done a better job of cleaning up its algorithms. It's not quite so useful as a tool for recruiting for ISIS, for example, as it was a few years ago. But, and in some ways I look at Google and I go, actually, your sort of anti-competitive practices, the way that you privilege your own products in sort of search rankings and in the way that Google Shopping interacts with search and so on is potentially, from a business perspective, something that needs to be looked at more. But certainly the fact that we just moved from an era of highly regulated, highly controlled communications, where to go from a small group of people to a large group of people, you needed a license, you needed to be a fit and proper person, you needed to submit to a fairly onerous regulatory regime. And we did that because we wanted, do a few things, but one of them was to kind of ensure a level of social cohesion such that our society might remain stable. And, you know, I think the fact that we have, you know, there have been great things that have come out of social media, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement, the, you know, Me Too, a whole bunch of sort of movements for social equity that were long overdue. I guess the big question we need to ask ourselves is this stuff entirely ungovernable? Or is there a way that we can retain the good while sort of taking the edges of the bad? And one of the things which I sort of wonder about is, you know, if you had this professional moderator class, like a lot of these issues come from the algorithm being geared towards, you know, it expands reach based on the level of interaction. You know, privileges comments at 10x are like privileges, so, you know, different kinds of reactions and shares. You know, that's the secret source of it all. But what it means is, and it does all that at lightning speed. And I think that the issue is when you have information, no matter how poorly sourced, no matter how divisive or dangerous, able to go from 1 to potentially millions within a very short space of time without anyone looking at it to say, is this thing actually, you know, something that we want as a society, that we want to go really wide? Aware that that's not uncomplicated, aware that there are speech issues, but it does seem like something that you could do a better job of than we are currently doing, which is no job at all.
Yeah, yeah. It's that no job at all part that's the really problematic area for us. It was quite interesting because I was having a conversation with a colleague today because I was telling him that we were doing this webinar tonight, and he used to work for the BBC, and he said it was really interesting being with the BBC because they had certain areas that they couldn't get into because they were blocked by countries. So they couldn't broadcast into North Korea. North Korea stopped them. They could actually broadcast into North Korea if you were very close to the border. You picked up North Korea, and there was North Korea desk, and you know you could hear stuff from them. They had the same issue with Iran. Iran used to block them because they were broadcasting in Persian. There are lots of people around the world who speak Persian, and they had Persian desk. It was outside of the country, but what Iran then did is it started to block them on the different platforms. So it blocked the radio, so they went from FM signal down to AM to see if they could get through. It blocked the satellite thing, so they went onto social media platforms, and it blocked those. So then what they did is they actually went onto the dark web to try and get the information through to people. And he said it was a really interesting ethical dilemma for them because it was like, you know, yeah, we are providing information, but what are we associating ourselves with? What are we starting to get bundled in with when we're operating on 4chan and platforms like this? Where, you know, do we start to give them legitimacy because we're the BBC? You know, what does this do? And I think it's possibly the same issue that, you know, not quite at that extreme, but it's something that we have to think about as well. You know, if we do leave it in this situation where we're much more hands-off about it and we go, no, we trust these organizations to do the right thing, and we start to see that it's not, you know, they make the argument we're just a platform, you know, we don't have, you know, anybody can put their content on here. Who do we start to get associated with? Who does our brand as organizations start to get attached to? And then how do we manage that? You know, do you want your good messages to start, you know, getting hooked up with the things that they shouldn't? And it's something that we really need to think hard about as communicators, and where do we, how do we manage that? How do we potentially, as organizations as well as countries, start to lend our voice to going, actually, no, really uncomfortable with where this is going? And what leverage do we have?
Yeah, I know. I think that's, you know, that there is Kevin Roos, the technology columnist for the New York Times, wrote an interesting piece recently at the back of the Facebook files, that first tranche of coverage that came out of the Wall Street Journal, and it basically it sort of looked at their sort of recent user data and the sort of shocking decline in, for example, usage of Facebook by teenagers, and the way that almost just understood it as an empire in decline. And there was kind of a sense that because they're doing such a poor job of making the platform a sort of a place that, does anything but make people angry and scared, and less engaged with reality, that it's starting to drive away anyone who might have used it a few years ago to genuinely keep up with friends and family. And I think that there is almost something in that. Like, you think about, sometimes you've got like a local mall that used to have all the big brands in it, and slowly they go away, and it's sort of $2 shops and vacancies and so on. And I think there is a sense that if Facebook doesn't get its arms around the problem, then it has a chance to become that. Just what I've never really understood is I think there's just such a profound business interest figuring this out. Like, before you get on the metaverse or trying to create the next thing, sort out this last thing, because yes, it's a profit engine, and one of the problems that we have as in some respects, as people who are interested in trying to improve its behavior through boycotts or sort of trying to reason with them, is that historically media platforms were restrained somewhat by their 10 biggest advertisers. If they started to do some really weird stuff, people would withdraw their campaigns. They'd lose money. They'd stop doing the weird stuff. Because Facebook is a small business platform with an incredibly long tail and is very cheap and effective for small businesses, it's got a huge moat around it. That means that, its 100 biggest advertisers could go away and it would still basically be fine. But I think that only holds for so long. Like, if governments were, if our government departments, for example, were to say, we no longer consider this a safe place to communicate. We don't think we can give, jobs to people and force them to look at this stuff because it's so vile, so racist, so misogynist, which, I think is a genuine employment issue for both public and private sector to consider, because we all have to moderate it ourselves, even if they won't moderate. We have to. So, I think there is a danger for Facebook that, there's a regulatory response that we could have. There is but there's also just people just slowly get off the sinking ship and into different environments. The issue is that it has this singular function and it is always purchased or cloned meaningful competition in the space. But the fact that it has completely lost the young, and increasingly, I'm sure that you've had the case, friends who just said, I don't want to be there anymore. And, they slowly disappear, and thus amplifies the sort of anger and the division.
Yeah, I mean, I'm of the generation that I'm deeply embedded in Facebook. It's a great way for me to be in touch with everybody around the world. So, I'm kind of caught in the tentacles, but, I'm sure if something better came along, I would try and dive in like everybody else. I think one of the other things is, if I actually think about, the situation overseas, and actually, Ross, I know that you're online, so I'd be really interested if you could put something in the chat about your perspective in Australia. But, there have been challenges, and when Australia tried to challenge them and Facebook kind of went, oh, well, okay, fine, we're leaving, there was an outcry, but we did manage to steer them down slightly. And, do we actually start to do that? I mean, you look at the rebranding that they've rolled out in the last week and you go, it's interesting timing. Everything's kicking off and all of a sudden you're back to being the bad guys again. And you decide to do a rebrand. You suddenly go, hey, guess what? We're not just Facebook. We're actually bigger than that. We're Meta. And you go, I mean, myself personally, I wouldn't have done a rebrand right now because there's too much swirling around here. There's too much distrust. This is not the time to do this. You're going to have to really brazen this one out. Like you say, fix this problem before you start to create a new one. So do we actually have that ability to steer them down right now and go, No, sort this out, and then we'll start to have a much better conversation about your responsibilities and what you might want to be doing in the future.
Yeah, I think that the idea that they're beyond regulation has been something that they have traded off for a long time. You know, Mark Zuckerberg, whatever you want to say about him, is a very clever person, and you know there is quite a long history of politicians who've pulled him in front of them to sort of the grandstand. That's enough to a gunfight. You know, he thinks about Facebook and has a far more sophisticated argument to put to you, and that I think has driven some of that. Politicians really like to be re-elected and don't like to be made to look foolish in front of a mass audience, and he's done that on a number of occasions. But I think you're seeing a new generation of politicians now who are much better schooled on the sort of intricacies of them and kind of know the sort of what the dance is like in terms of the various arguments that are put forward. So, I think the Australian example was really, really profoundly instructive as pertains to both Google and Facebook, in that, there was a sense there, and I was speaking to friends I have at both companies through this period, and they were stressed like I've really seen people stressed. That was an absolute monumental fight. I hope that there is a good book brewing somewhere about it, because it was just a fascinating, historically interesting episode in this kind of long tussle between governments and those tech giants. And I think what you saw there, that the ACCC's report and the mandatory bargaining code, I don't think was good legislation. I wouldn't have drawn it like that. But what it did do was say, if you have any kind of legislative hammer, even if there are relatively easy, good arguments you can make against it, what will they do? And they both said, Google said that we might turn off search, and immediately Microsoft said, hey, we're here.
We've got a thing called Bing.
Totally. We're uncontroversial now somehow, 20 years later.
Yeah.
And we could make you a map service. We'll try and make Bing cool somewhere. Then Facebook literally did turn news off in the newsfeed, which also entailed turning off the Australian Weather Service. A hurricane was bearing down on the country,
Yeah.
And both of them folded and made deals with the companies. Now, that I think is so instructive about that the government and actually has much more power than it thinks, because while they are quasi-monopolistic within their areas of particular kinds of social and particularly Google within search and various other related products, they also are, in some ways, there are giant tectonic plate-sized competitors who have their own dominant fields, whether it's Apple or Microsoft or Salesforce or whoever else. They've got these products that are right there and very adaptable, and where they so that's why I don't think they actually ever would leave a territory, even one as small as New Zealand, on principle, just because you made some a legislative effort to restrain them, especially if I don't see us doing anything kind of particularly draconian. We're not going to do China-style screen time limits for children, much as I wish we would. We're much more likely to do something small and reasonable and see what happens. And then the other thing is just, we can tax companies. We can just say there is just a revenue tax of 10%, and you can leave the country if you want, but you won't, because $900 million is still pretty good, even if it's not quite as good as $1 billion. So I think, and with that money, you can sort of start to claw back some of the social harm. We have excise taxes on alcohol for a reason. We have taxes on petrol for a reason. There are social costs and infrastructural costs that we have to pay associated with those products. And why do we just continue to eat the cost as a society of social and search? I think that's just a no-brainer, and some government sooner or later will enact that, and I hope that we're a fast follower.
Yeah. It's, yeah. I still come back to, well, I mean, there was an interesting podcast on Radio New Zealand last night, The Detail, and they did talk about Facebook's move into the metaverse. And it's interesting what you say about the fact that, they are monopolistic, but there is competition. Because what they were talking about last night was actually Facebook doesn't own the metaverse. The metaverse already exists. There are actually organizations already doing this stuff. They just haven't gone out in a big way. And there's, so Facebook's actually trying to move into an area that others are in. And it means that they are actually going to come up against competition. Like you say, Microsoft's doing this stuff already. Microsoft's been uncool for a very long time. But if it actually says, listen, we're going to be a bit more ethical, we're going to be the boring granddad at the party, but at least you can trust us not to do something really dodgy. And Apple is going to sit there and go, well, can we start to get some of the pie back as well? They were talking about the fact that if you want to talk about a metaverse, you just have to look at Fortnite. Fortnite has actually evolved from being just a game where people went in, where people now actually live their lives a lot more. They're doing the stuff that Mark Zuckerberg's trying to pitch to us around what his metaverse is going to look like. If the kids don't want to go to Facebook and they're already living in Fortnite, does he start to feel that hurt a bit more? Does it start to put the pressure on them in ways that they haven't felt for a long time?
I mean, I think that the rebranding to Meta and the attempt to own the concept of the metaverse, which you say has been around for a long, long time, and there are companies which are embodying it far better. Epic, who create Fortnite, as you say, and Roblox, which my kids live in, is another great example of a metaverse type company, and both of them seem to be doing it with a much greater sense of openness than has ever been a hallmark of Facebook. And quite honestly, some of this does just come back down to personality types. Like Mark Zuckerberg is a student of classics, has a very kind of almost a warlike view of business, and he's got a very close relationship with Peter Thiel, who has a techno-libertarian kind of viewpoint that is reasonably well documented here. And I think you can really feel the personality of Zuckerberg and the influence of Thiel from an intellectual perspective on him. And I sort of think that the metaverse does, as much as he's viewing it as this sort of business opportunity to leave all this mess in the background and go and conquer new land, but I think that as a society, we sort of have the opportunity, and I almost think you can already feel the repugnance of the response to the idea that he will own this new land when he's already sort of messed up the one that we're in now, that we can think of better people to be the sort of world boss of the metaverse. I think
it's not what I'm looking for.
No, and there's a hint of desperation in it, and that I guess again speaks to that sort of Kevin Roose theory of it being an empire in decline. That on some level gives me hope that maybe the problem actually is, in this instance, one man. And if Mark Zuckerberg goes, just as Sundar Pichai has kind of brought new, sort of rigor to Google, and like we've seen when they move out of the founders governing them period, these giant technology companies get a bit more boring and normal, and tire of just constantly fighting wars, and say, actually, let's just really focus on that, and then we can just get down to making some good, boring, reliable money, and Tim Cook's Apple is a lot less interesting than Steve Jobs' Apple, but it's also like, what, 4 or 5 times bigger than when Steve Jobs died a decade ago. And I think, again, this is it going to just be that that shareholder? I mean, the problem is that he's got a supermajority of voting stock, so he can't be removed in a conventional sense. But even he might tire of this endless warfare, or society might just say, you know what, you're not allowed to wage your battles and your culture wars on our turf anymore. But it feels like it's something that's coming to a head, and just changing a company's name and focus isn't going to cut it.
So is it almost, like I said at the start, these are very new companies. Are we basically dealing with really stroppy teenagers just acting up in a room until they start to mature? And we go, right, okay, now we can have a sensible conversation with you. You're not just going to storm off and slam the door.
I mean, I actually do think about that a lot, about how relatively young these companies are, and how relatively young Mark Zuckerberg is, and how weird his life has been. To sort of be a billionaire at such a young age, and surrounded by he's always surrounded by himself by hardcore loyalists. He hates to be challenged, and that some of that does you just do sort of go, well, when people mature, they tend to get over. They tend to enjoy different things, have a different sort of value set, and I guess with Zuckerberg, I do wonder about whether it's gonna, whether if it were to happen by now, whether it would have. And maybe we need, if we're just going to kind of continue this metaphor, the parents of the stroppy teenager being the sort of society and institutions that birthed it, need to send him to his room, or at least kind of put him in timeout, give him some screen time limits, whatever your version of disciplining is, and that's regulations, and that's
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we kind of had the same with Microsoft, where for a long time they were just too difficult, too hard to deal with. And like we say, now we've got Bill Gates, just the really nice, boring guy who makes good, reliable products that somehow have got themselves really enmeshed in our lives.
Well, I think Bill Gates is quite an interesting example, right? Like, I think that he was running Microsoft in an anti-competitive way. There was an antitrust case. There were sort of major implications for that during the period when we did that kind of thing. Bill Gates eventually tired of it. He found a new thing to be obsessed with, and he's actually become, one of the greatest philanthropists there has ever been. I don't know if Mark Zuckerberg's, I can imagine that in his future, but you wouldn't have imagined that for Bill Gates back in the day either. So, I think whenever these companies are very young, and our relationship to them as societies, and our understanding of what they're doing, because they have speed and evolution and kind of move fast and break things, that old Facebook slogan baked into their DNA. It has taken us a while to really see them and to understand what they are and what they're doing to us as a species. But I feel like there are enough smart people in positions of power now who see them and really understand what it is they're doing, that this can change. And I'd love to think that New Zealand would let it change before we get to, before that next protest tries to break through the barricades, and before we have hundreds of thousands of dead, and before we elect a demagogue, So I just think maybe it's worth giving it a crack.
Brilliant. Well, I mean, we're sort of coming up to time. Does anybody have any questions for Duncan, or any comments that they want to put into the chat? I got some comments, but everybody's gone very quiet. I assume you're all digesting this very, very carefully and thinking hard about what you do. But has anybody got anything that they'd like to ask, like to share, like to talk to us about? I just think everybody's really worried and thinking about how we regulate this. Where do we go? What do we do?
Well, look, if anyone wants to get in touch at the back of it, I'm just Duncan at thespinoff.co.nz, and like I said at the top, it's my favourite topic. I I feel like anything that we want to do from a communications perspective, whether it's convince people to take better and faster action on climate change, whether it's solve some big social issues, it's going to involve one way or another social media and the big technology companies. And the more that people like those on this call can think about the ways that they can sort of push, whether it's their own businesses or their government relations people, whatever it is, to sort of take this issue more seriously. I think that's I just think it's an imperative that we all share at the moment.
Yeah, so Shamed's asked the question, what do you see as the immediate future of social and how it is managed? I guess part of that is us also putting the pressure on. So it's not just coming from the media where they might go, hey, you guys have got a vested interest, but it's organisations actually starting the conversation, using their very own platforms to start the conversation.
Yeah, I think that you've seen some quite, like, I really admire Sinead at start the way they essentially left Facebook. It was a brave decision. It would have been totally foolhardy for a media company. Like I say, I admire her. I followed her with our business, but I think it shows that there is a sort of a spectral hold that these platforms have over us, where you think they're horrible, but we have to be there. We might, but we don't necessarily have to be there on the terms that they set. I think that you're seeing increasingly organisations that are default turning off comments on posts and sacrificing some engagement for a more sort of safe and hospitable environment. And I think that you'll see, or narrowing the use of those platforms, and not saying we'll try and have everything running through them. We might, we'll use our EDMs and try and grow those databases more, or that there are, because they became and they were so central to our conception of the world, was like you have to be on social. That's where all the energy and excitement is. I think now we're seeing the energy and excitement curdling into protests on the steps of Parliament and anti-vaccination kind of rabble, and we just there's a sort of a future of social media which is a bit quieter and you withdraw from a little and try and control and tamp down the conversation somewhat.
Yeah, it's almost like taking your privacy back slightly and going, I'll talk to you about this, but I'm not actually going to engage with you on this. Yeah, I'll let you see so much, but after this.
It's so much. When you see big brands trying to litigate with irate people on social media, I'm like, that just looks horrible for everyone. Surely there's a better way to resolve a dispute of that nature. Yeah,
exactly. Well, thank you very much. Like I said, it's a massive topic. We've just chipped away at it very slightly.
Well, I feel like we solved it, to be honest. Just roll that one into select committee.
Yeah, cool. There you go, just like that. No problem. Thank you very much for being with us. Good luck counting down the hours. Begin now.
Thank you. It's
I mean, coming from Wellington, it is actually nice to walk around, even if you get caught up in mobs on the street on some days. That's part of the course.
That's true. No, I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I think it's like it's the second one of our time, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, and for everybody, I strongly advise check out what the Spin-Off's doing in this area, engage in the content, become a subscriber, because that will help Duncan. Yeah, and thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Duncan. Thank you, everybody. Have a really good night. Good luck getting out of lockdown.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye.